Now before you all go storming into the comments to defend your favourite MMO, I just want to give you a small snippet of the ending. Guild Wars 2 deserved a lot more attention than it got, but not at the cost of Final Fantasy XIV. There's a lot more to that statement, and I hope you stick around to see what the ending is. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I've recently gotten back into Guild Wars 2 while Final Fantasy XIV has had its long queues and the content has started to dry out as I've finished the MSQ and the current 8-man raids. Having played Guild Wars 2 a long time ago, back when you actually had to buy it, I was pleasantly surprised at how much quality content was available and how little catch-up there was for me to do. This then begged the question, why didn't Guild Wars 2 get the same boost in players as Final Fantasy XIV did earlier this year? So in this video, I want to recap what that big shake-up in the MMO genre was, why Final Fantasy XIV got the lion's share, then look at Guild Wars 2 in more detail, both the good and the bad, before starting to draw some comparisons between the two games. As ultimately at this stage, Final Fantasy XIV is a game that kind of needs no introduction, but unfortunately, in my experience, Guild Wars 2 does. And I'll be doing all of this to hopefully answer the question of the video, did Guild Wars 2 deserve more attention? Before we begin, I'll be returning to the video essay style of content with a new video out every 2 weeks talking about certain games and the industry with a smattering of some more experimental videos in between. So if any of that sounds interesting, please like and subscribe below. So first, recapping the great MMO exodus of mid-2021. It's almost impossible to look back and pick a specific point in time which really indicated the beginning of the end for World of Warcraft's total dominance in the MMO genre. You could say at the end of Wrath of the Lich King when the subline started to go down for the first time in its life, Warlords of Draenor when they cut out half the content, or just Battle for Azeroth. Regardless of where you personally put that point in time, nobody can deny that the player base for WoW has been in steady decline for a very long time. Interestingly, the seeds of the Great Exodus were sown not by what World of Warcraft was doing, but by what it wasn't. The last expansion, Shadowlands, released in November 2020, and we didn't see the first content patch until 7 months later in June 2021. Even with all the retention mechanics, daily chores, and pure mechanical grinds in the launch version of the game, everyone who cared to do so had completely finished Shadowlands well before the first patch. Burnout was common, and especially with content creators who had already squeezed every last bit of entertainment they could from WoW. The dam holding back the players from leaving en masse was already leaking with a natural trickle of players leaving WoW, but the first big dam break happened when the biggest WoW streamer, Asmongold, finally made the jump and gave Final Fantasy XIV a shot. In what was one of his most successful streams, with almost 1 million individual viewers over the duration, he paved the way for a great many other streamers to follow suit. Soon, Final Fantasy XIV hype was everywhere as streamers from all over and importantly, their audiences shifted away from WoW. While that dam could have been shored up by Blizzard PR under normal circumstances and stemmed the bleeding just a little, the coup de grace for World of Warcraft came shortly after with the allegations of mass sexual misconduct endemic throughout all of Activision Blizzard. There's no holding back the exodus now. Anyone outside the most hardcore of World of Warcraft players have left for greener pastures. World of Warcraft as a game isn't dead by any measure, but it's this exodus which really marks when it was no longer the dominant force in the MMO genre. This then begs the question of why Final Fantasy XIV got the lion's share of the players that left WoW, as it's a little too easy to just say the streamers did it and leave it at that. I go into it in a bit more detail in my video Why Final Fantasy XIV Won, which I personally recommend, but to give a summary, it came down to two main factors in my eyes, the community and the Final Fantasy XIV team. First is the fan base, which really went out of its way to tell people about Final Fantasy XIV's free trial, so much that it became a meme. The fact that the free trial is actually really good and includes the first expansion for free, which by the way there are whispers of Square Enix looking to include Stormblood, the second expansion as well, into that free trial, would actually be insane. Then just add on all the improvements year after year, becoming one of the best games that I've played in a good long while. Then lastly, the Final Fantasy XIV team itself, with special regard to their game head Yoshi P. I do also want to specify that I'm talking about the Final Fantasy XIV team, not Square Enix more broadly. Looking at the company's track record last year on whole, with the Marvel game, Outriders, and talk of NFTs in the New Year's speech, the best thing they've done is give unprecedented powers to Yoshi P in how he runs Final Fantasy XIV. Regardless of how many factors contribute to the end result, the fact that they've had to completely stop free trials and selling the game to stop people from overcrowding the servers, not once but twice at the tail end of 2021, should be enough indication that Final Fantasy XIV really just exploded during the exodus. This then takes us on to Guild Wars 2. It would be disingenuous to say that it didn't benefit from the migration away from WoW, with every game population measuring site showing a peak in the July-September 2021 period, but it was a relatively minor boost before cooling down in the holiday season. season. Why only the small bump in popularity? Well, let's have a look at Guild Wars 2 in more detail and see if we can distill what the deciding factor was. Guild Wars 2 is an old game, coming out all the way back in August 2012, which was during a high point in the MMO genre as a whole. World of Warcraft was in the Cataclysm expansion and still boasting more than 10 million subscribers. Tens of other games like Star Wars: The Old Republic, Neverwinter, and even A Realm Reborn were all plus or minus a year from Guild Wars' release. Even in this competitive environment, Guild Wars 2 sold more than 2 million copies in the first 2 weeks post-launch. Its business model was buy to play without a subscription element to it, although there was an in-game shop where you could buy premium currency called gems to purchase either cosmetics or, more controversially, gold. Despite this, the game was very highly reviewed, with 90 out of 100 being the general score given to it by games journalists and players alike. As a game, it really stood out from its peers for a lot of reasons. First was the unique, action-oriented combat system and not the click and kill that we're used to from World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy XIV. Secondly, the game didn't have any traditional quests. Instead, you'd level up through doing basically anything: crafting, exploring, player versus player, events, and completing hearts, which were as close to the quests as you get in the game. Thirdly was the living world, which has led to the game being very different over time, as it changed physically along with the story. Fourthly was that story, being called specifically your personal story, which was based on your choices in character creation and gives you somewhat impactful choices throughout the story to make. Then lastly was the big one, the PvP. You could either participate in small objective-based battles where everyone was on equal footing, or the World v World, which boasted huge battles over fortifications with a myriad of siege weapons for both attackers and defenders. Since its release, it's gone through a few big changes, with the biggest going free-to-play in 2015 after selling 5 million copies beforehand. It's had 2 major expansions, both introducing wildly new ways to get around the world, with the first one, Heart of Thorns, introducing gliding, and the second, Path of Fire, bringing in mounts. Then lastly is just the living world, with 7 huge additions to the stories, including the expansions, since release, with the 8th season coming alongside the next expansion, End of Dragons, sometime in February. While, like any game, it's had its up and downs, Guild Wars 2 is still a large game with a stable player base, which is stuck with the game for almost a decade, which is a rare accomplishment in the MMO space. So while I touched on some of the unique points just before, I now want to start going through them in a bit more depth and giving my own opinions and views on the game in kind of an informal review. Starting by what I'm the biggest fan of, being the combat system and everything around it. Like I mentioned in brief before, the combat is far more action-oriented with a big emphasis on positioning and dodging. The dodging element gives you a sense of agency in combat in both PvE and PvP, which makes you feel like a bit of a badass when you just evade huge attacks from enemies instead of just getting lucky with a passive 5% dodge chance, more standard in other games like World of Warcraft. The positioning part becomes important depending on what weapon you're using. Like every game ever, you need to face your opponent to hit them, and with ranged weapons it's pretty much what you expect. But for melee weapons, though, it becomes a lot more interesting as virtually everything you do has a passive cleave effect on it. Even though I've got a main target that I'm attacking, if I've also managed to pull a second baddie, when my swing goes through him on its merry little way to my main target, it also hits the secondary guy. This means you end up dancing around to get enemies in the perfect position to deal maximum damage. Naturally, getting into melee range is also the most dangerous place for you to be, so it feels good when you get the skills to be able to dive into melee, dodging attacks and dealing tons of damage to everything. Then you have the skills you have access to, which can be broken down into 2 categories: weapon skills and class skills. You have 5 weapon abilities depending on what weapon you've got equipped, and most classes can switch between 2 weapons at will in combat for access to 10 total. After this, you have 5 class skills, 1 dedicated for healing, 1 ultimate, and 3 you can choose for free. You have tons of unlocks, so you have plenty of options to choose from for all of these slots. But these can't be changed in combat, so you've got to have your setup done beforehand. The other important thing to set up for combat is your build. Every class has access to 5 normal and 2 elite specializations, which, similar to the class skills, you progressively unlock. A build then consists of 3 specializations, with only one of them being able to be an elite one, as these are gameplay defining specs. This gives you tons of options and flexibilities for your chosen class to really play in a style that you prefer. Although naturally this does tend to lead to a bit of meta forming, this is only really relevant for PvP, as there isn't as much formal PvE raiding or dungeons as you'd find in other games, so it's really worth experimenting to find the playstyle that works for you, especially with the elite specializations, as they are truly gameplay defining. The best example being the Thief's Spec Deadeye, which turns you from a primarily sneaky shadow stepping cloak and dagger figure to a long range sniper. This system just lets you play the way you want, and if you do give Guild Wars 2 a go, I highly recommend experimenting with your build. While giving you tons of options, it also gives your opponents tons of options as well. So there are a lot of spice when it comes to my next favourite thing about Guild Wars 2, the PvP. First thing to talk about is the biggest unique selling point being the World v World system, which is where 3 servers fight it out over 4 persistent maps. Territory gained and lost stays that way until other players change it, with one map being the de facto home base for each of the servers, where the home team has a huge advantage in terms of their position, then a 4th perfectly equal map with a giant fortress in the middle of it. When the Eternal Battlegrounds are quiet, it's pretty boring, but get on at peak time when there are a couple of big guilds online conducting operations, and it's some of the most fun you can have in gaming. Quickly setting up a siege position with a couple of players, screening defenders, or being one of those defenders trying to destroy the siege line at all costs is an incredible experience. You see the map change, the push and pull of different factions, and you get rewarded for it. This mode isn't super balanced, but when you've got a horde of characters charging the lines of your enemy, it doesn't need to be balanced. It's just too much fun. The actual formal PvP though is very balanced. Everyone, no matter what your level, is raised to 80, gear levels are totally equalized, you have access to all the skills, specializations, and it then really just comes down to your own skill and the build that you experiment with. In terms of the maps themselves, they're all 5v5 and include Point Control, Oddball from Halo, Deathmatch, and a quasi-Dota style game where you need to defend your boss while at the same time sending waves of NPCs to the enemy's boss. These are normally fairly well balanced, and I haven't been stomped or stomped another team too many times, at least in my experience. Speaking of those world servers, Guild Wars 2 has some of the best server management that I've ever seen, and I feel like this is something that a lot of games could learn from. They actively make sure that there are always players in each zone by dynamically merging layers as best they can. If you enter a new zone on the map, you get put into the most populated version of it, and if for whatever reason that layer on that server gets depopulated, then you'll be given the option to transfer to a more populated one, which then closes the old layer. The best part is that there's no reason to stay on the old map. You are incentivized with a 15-minute buff to XP to go to a more populated server layer to engage with more people. The end result of this is that every zone always feels alive. Even if there are only 10 people in the entire world in that zone, you'll still come across others, and that feeling of a populated world is, in my opinion, vital for the long-term health of any MMORPG. Those other people in the world are the next thing I want to touch on, as generally I'm a big fan of the Guild Wars 2 community. There are plenty of pretentious elitist bastards like any game, and on a whole the community of Guild Wars 2 is far more insular than that of its peers, but it's no less one of the nicest I've come across. There are a great many group events that pop up across the world, which you need to do for certain big objectives like getting powerful gear or even mounts, and it's not long before other people rock up pretty regularly to do them, even if they're in very obscure places. Each time I've done this, I've had brief and friendly chats with others, even getting a group screenshot with 3 other players when we managed to 4-man a difficult group event, which normally calls for 10 plus in the time limit allowed. It's a very cooperative game, and thanks to those dynamic servers, there are always others around to fight through the game's challenges together. Now, I mentioned the word mount, which in Guild Wars 2 is a little different than normal. Instead of having tons of different types of mounts that all function very similarly to collect, there are only a handful in Guild Wars 2 that all have very unique skills. For instance, the Raptor can jump very far distances, the Skimmer lets you glide on water, and the Roller Beetle lets you Tokyo drift your way around Tyria. This system just feels fun, and it's not overly hard to get the basic set of mounts just going through the Path of Fire expansion story, although some of the later ones can include massive grinds, the most infamous of these being the Sky Scale, which is like a semi-dragon and one of the few mounts that can properly fly when you get used to actually using them. On top of this, there is a collectible element with mount skins, although this is predominantly real cash items, but do allow you to apply dyes to your mount, so you can freshen up their look on a whim. The dye system more broadly is also pretty damn good in Guild Wars 2. Once you've collected a dye colour, you permanently unlock it and can apply it at will to any piece of gear or your mount for no cost if you own the game. The free-to-play players do need to use a transmutation gem thing, which are pretty rare, so this is more of a feature for those who upgrade to the full version. This then leads me on to the business model, which I've got mixed feelings about. Basically, everything in this game is kind of for sale. You want more inventory slots for your bags? You can buy it. Bank slots? You can buy those too. More slots for extra builds for your character? Why, of course. Want a device that can tell you where all the world bosses are and instantly teleports you to them? Sure, you got the cash, we've got the service. And that last one, by the way, is really helpful, and full disclosure, I've put money into the microtransactions of this game. It's kind of worth it. So on one hand, it's always a pain when games do this, but on the other, as it's now a free-to-play game, it's also how this game brings in consistent funds. It also allows you as a player to incrementally upgrade your account as the need arises. If you don't put stuff in the bank, then you don't need to invest in it. but if you want to have a max level of every class, then you can purchase character slots as needed. I do wish there was less convenience items in there, but I can understand why they are. Beyond buying cosmetics and convenience gadgets, you can also buy the story. Well, specifically the story that's already been completed. Since Guild Wars 2 is a living world, the story was designed to be played alongside that changing world. This normally means that if you're up to date, you can play the next story segment for free during that patch. But once the patch is over and the story beat is past, you then need to buy access to old story segments. This allows current players to have a fairly consistent pace of new content, with patches being between 2 to 4 months, while allowing people to go back and play through previous content. I should note as well that the story for the expansions comes in full when you purchase it, but not the season after, which must be purchased individually. So what then is the total cost of Guild Wars 2 if you were a free-to-play player thinking of upgrading? The non-expansion stories would cost a total of 4,160 gems without a sale, which would require you to buy the 4,000 gem and 800 gem bundles at the total cost of $60. To then buy the games, which gives you access to the elite specializations from each one and the additional story, is another $30. So the total buy-in to Guild Wars 2 for a brand new player comes at about 90 USD, with 600 odd gems left over to buy some cosmetics. Now, I'll be honest, the value proposition on this is actually incredible, as to complete all that story takes on average 87 hours and upwards of 140 if you're being very casual and doing all the mini objectives as well. And this is just the story, not to mention the entire world that opens up, as a lot of those story patches come with an entire zone, currencies, objectives, new world events, and just tons of different things to do, which really, for the most part, are still active to this day. Without the subscription component, you can incrementally invest money and time into the game at your own pace, knowing that there won't be anything lost if you do take your time. But it is also free if you do the story if it's current, so it's something to take into account whether or not it's worth just being current. What I should also mention as an aside here is that the story can be done in any order when you hit level 80, which is the maximum level in the game. The gearing as well, which is a point I'll expand on later, also doesn't change, so once you hit max and get some exotic gear, which is the most bang for your buck, you can really do whatever. Hell, if you really want to, you could just buy End of Dragons without any of the previous stuff or expansions and dive right into that. Although, naturally, I'd recommend you looking at the older stuff. This then just takes us back to the story side of things, as 87 hours is a lot of story to get through, and on a whole, I absolutely love it. The early levels are a bit of more of a mixed bag between being good and being just, well, a bit comical. The first 2 to 3 story beats are entirely defined by character creation. Both your race and your choices matter, so there is a little less attention paid to these. So you have situations where everyone in the human kingdom is corrupt and a word from a single commoner is enough to bring a member of the council to trial, or how an undead army is coming to attack the queen, so logically the only thing to do is set a trap in the throne room in the middle of the biggest city of the human kingdom, let the undead come into the city straight for the queen, then spring the trap to catch them. It's all kind of silly fun, and playing through it with a couple of friends talking trash is hilarious. I should also note that if you and your friends are on the same story step, you can just join each other in the instant sections and get credit for it. The only downside is that the person who started it controls the choices, so try to take turns on who's boss in each section. After these characters define sections, we then move on to the main narrative, and from here, things start to get a little wilder. To save some room on an already substantial script, I won't go through the entire story. I may save that for another video. But here we start going down the path of fighting the Elder Dragons, who are the predominant threat to the world, which eventually leads us to our next expansion, the End of Dragons, which, well, should be very, very interesting. Next, let's talk about what I love about the character leveling and alt experience. Leveling is typically done by map completion, where each map contains points of interest, vistas, hero points you use in those class skills and specializations, and lastly, hearts. The hearts are the interesting twist on the questing system, as you go to the location of the heart, see the list of things you can do to help, and then just do whichever ones you want to do until you fill up that heart. You can also alternatively complete events that occasionally spawn around those hearts to fill it up that way. So every time you level up a new character, it feels very, very different. Those events actually are the best way to actually do the hearts, because you get the XP for completing the heart, you get XP for the events. If you're just traveling the map, you get XP for the points of interest, the vistas. Getting more hero points gives you extra XP. If you decide to take a break from leveling and do professions, that gives you both profession XP and character level experience. The story every 10 levels gives you a big chunk of XP as well, and just a ton of other rewards. You basically can't do anything in this game and not get rewarded experience, so every time you level an alt, you can approach it in an entirely different way. The core of this game really is just giving you so much flexibility in how you want to play it. Then there's just the alt experience itself. Everything except for the story progress and inventory space is shared amongst all your characters. The bank, storage, unlocks like the mounts and the gliders, then other stuff like currency are all shared amongst your account. The highest level of gear you can get can be freely transferred between characters of the same armor type, and all in all, it's an incredibly smooth experience where you feel like you're always contributing to your overall progress. The last thing I want to mention, which is purely good in my book, is just the aesthetic and the music. Even with the graphics not changing over much since the 2012 release, the game holds up incredibly well with a huge variety of locations. Snowy peaks to dense jungle, magical to technological. In a way, it kind of reminds me of the same mix between magic and tech that we see in most Final Fantasy games, except just a little bit more Western in style. On a whole, the world is a pleasure to travel through, all highlighted especially by one of the most beautiful skyboxes I've seen in games for a long time. The race variety as well should be given special mention on the aesthetic as well, as each of the 5 races is incredibly diverse in terms of their own looks. The humans are classic fantasy kingdom. The Norn are tall, broad, shamanistic Vikings who have access to a mustache with its own physics. The Azura are competent gnomes with sleek magical technology and golems. The Char are steampunk, god-slaying catmen who are about as metal as you get. And then lastly are the Sylvari, who only existed on the world for about 25 years but are so good at nature magic that they build entire settlements out of leaves. Then, music and audio design more broadly is also very solid. While the music never really ventures outside of the classic orchestral tracks you expect from most RPG games, it's all competently crafted, and there are some absolutely insane moments, especially in the story, where the music swells at the right time and the whole experience is just incredible. The audio design itself, more broadly, is all very fitting, and there haven't been any times that I can personally recall that I heard something that just doesn't fit into the world. So that's everything that I love. The combat, the builds, the PvP, the story, the leveling, the alt experience, the relatively low price aesthetic, and the music. Of course, however, no game is perfect, so now I want to go through what I don't like in the form of tutorials, gearing, the endgame, and the RPG Holy Trinity. We'll start off pretty basic with the tutorial, which does at least exist in some form. When you start your character, you get put into a small instance zone with a fairly linear story dependent on your race. This starts your personal story as well as starts to get you acquainted with the game, although this is primarily done by text boxes and arrows to different odds and ends. This tutorial does an alright job at showing out basic combat mechanics, but where it falls down is a lot later down the line. Remember all those weapon, class, and specialization skills that I mentioned just before? Think about trying to decipher all of that without very little guidance. Really, trying to figure out what a competent build and actually engage with the flexibility that the system really allows you to is something that you just have to do through pure trial and error. In fact, I'd personally recommend looking at external meta ones that you can find online to get a handle on it before experimenting with yourself. For me personally, because you get 3 specialization slots which come in at different levels, I would love if a part of your personal story, the ending of one of them had a mini tutorial which highlighted it, and a few of the more advanced features a bit more. Maybe push the first spec back to level 30 when you choose an order to join in your story, and then have that order go through the system with you. If you're a new player especially, this would help out immensely. This also goes beyond just the builds as well. Big game features like collections in the achievement section, being vital for unlocking weapons, gear, or even mounts, isn't explained very well. Your typical endgame of raids, world bosses, and big events, and just a lot of the game is missing an explanation. While you can stumble into a lot of this stuff yourself, it sometimes feels like a game where you need a wiki open on a second monitor to get the full experience. Hell, I'm not even sure if gear levels are explained at all, as I only learned relatively recently that the difference between an ascended and a legendary piece of gear is that you can change the stats on a legendary at will, while the ascended piece is static, while both having the same value to your character's overall power. Which makes now a good time to talk about gear. Endgame gearing requires 2 big things: tons of money and time. For an endgame character, there's only really 3 tiers of loot. Exotic items, which are fairly cheap, solid stats, and what most characters will have a full set of. Ascended gear, which is about 10 to 15% better than exotics, has the highest stats in the game. Then lastly is legendary, which has the same stat distributions of ascended, but like mentioned previously, you can change what stats are on them at will, which makes them a lot more versatile. I should also note that this gear hasn't changed in power level throughout any of the expansions. If you got an ascended piece back in the day on launch, then it's just as powerful now as it was back then. While there are some pieces of ascended gear that you can get through collections, rare drops in events, and some hearts in later expansions, the primary way to get these best in slot pieces is through laurels and crafting. The laurels are a separate currency which you primarily get through login rewards and are more tied to the ascended rings, amulets, and accessories, where you get a maximum of 55 per month. The amulet costs 30, Each ring costs 35 and each accessory 40, which comes to a total of 180 laurels, or just over 3 months of logging on every day to get a full set. These pieces you can't craft yourself and are more commonly found in other vendors, although they also take a fair chunk of time to grind out themselves. The next method is crafting, which is primarily for your armor and weapons. You need to have a max level crafter, which is very resource or cash intensive process in the first place, and then the actual pieces themselves are expensive to make. First are the recipes, which cost gold or laurels to obtain, and then you need the recipe for the actual piece of gear and another recipe for the components for that gear. So if you want to craft a helmet, you need the helmet recipe and the recipe for the insignia, which defines the stats on the helm. Then when crafting, there are raw materials which you can't buy. You need to engage in endgame content for them, which is good as this is endgame gear, but it takes a while to grind out enough for a single piece, let alone all of them. All of this gives you something to aim at, but getting a full set of Ascended armor is a huge pain. Although you can transfer it at will between characters, you're still limited by the type of armor. My main is warrior and I have a full set of Ascended heavy gear, but can only transfer that heavy armor across the characters that can use it. Of the 9 total classes, while this is a really good target to have, it really just comes down to gold, which you're then incentivized to buy with real money as you can transfer gems into gold. Especially if you want a set for all of your characters, as for light armor you'd need a tailor at max skill, medium you'd need a leatherworker, heavy armor is armor smithing, and then for weapons there's weaponsmithing, huntsman and artificer. So I don't even want to hazard a guess at the cost of a set of Ascended gear for everything. I'm just thankful I know that the gear isn't going to be obsolete after all of this effort. Next though is the endgame, where you get all the materials required for Ascended crafting, which can be a bit lackluster. The PvP is an eternal struggle, which is always good fun to engage in, and you can properly do the World v World mode at max level, so no problems there. But the PvE, on the other hand, is where I personally think it needs a lot of work. You've got a couple of options. First is the world bosses and world events. Then secondly are the raids and dungeons. The world stuff is going to be the major stuff you'll be doing, with the world bosses all being on a certain timer, and normally you'll encounter world boss trains, which will bounce from boss to boss, getting a daily kill in, which provides massive rewards. To make this world boss process a lot easier is that item I mentioned way earlier, which shows you the upcoming threats and then being able to just teleport straight to them. Another huge pay for convenience option, and honestly would love if you could get it by normal means, as this is almost necessary to engage in the world boss meta, as the alternative is to hope that a train is running between them and they show you what waypoint to travel to, or you keep an active lookout and time when the next world boss is meant to spawn. And yes, there are wikis for this, but I mean, why would you go for a wiki when you can just pay $5 and do it fairly easily? Then those world events are zone-wide campaigns that can last from between half an hour to multiple hours depending on the zone. These include an organized push from a hidden forest base all the way through a World War I-esque battlefield up to a frozen fortress, another where night descends on the jungle and you have to defend multiple settlements from waves of enemies. Then, once the threat is averted, you take copters into the canopy to fight big bosses for even bigger loot. These are actually pretty good fun, with extra rewards at the end based on participation and how everyone on the map managed to actually succeed in the event. Then there is the raiding in the dungeons. The dungeons are all from the base version of the game, and none have been added in any of the new expansions, which is hugely disappointing, as each of these dungeons are a mini story and really good fun. The raids themselves, which I haven't had the pleasure to engage in myself, do get additions in each expansion, but there are still very few of these as well. The biggest disappointment for these though is that because of world events, bosses, or just crafting is a more efficient way to get gear, there are very few groups going for either dungeons or raids. So if you're thinking of getting into this, then try to get another 4 friends so you've got at least a consistent dungeon group going. This relative lack of raids and dungeons in the endgame also isn't helped by the lack of the holy RPG trinity of tank, healer, and DPS, which does limit how much they can do with boss design. While threat and aggro do technically exist, and you can spec a little bit closer to tanking or supporting, most bosses from what I've seen turn into just organized zergs, where your main aim is to do mechanics and then just have everyone use their general healing abilities to make sure nobody goes down and keep pressing the kill buttons. As someone who's a huge fan of raiding and dungeons in other games, this is one of the more disappointing aspects of the game, and is likely contributes to the lack of long-term staying power for a lot of people, which frankly sucks. I'd love to see this developed in future with a few more dungeons and a bit of development for raiding. as they have a taunt condition some classes and specs can apply, but without then a single target healing spell, there is only so much you can do with design overall. For instance, if a boss has to have a tank buster ability, then you pretty much are going to wipe out the de facto tank because, well, they don't have as many cooldowns or defensives, and then you don't have healers who also have defensive cooldowns that they could use or have big heals prepped. I really think that the game would be well suited if they had elite specializations that were more of a dedicated healing spec or a dedicated tank spec. Just something that really allows for a bit more separation into the tank healing DPS archetype, because once you have that, it really opens up how much more you can do with the design of your game. Look at Final Fantasy XIV specifically, they play around with this a lot more, where you have bosses that you actually have to say, oh, you can't step on this spot as a DPS, like only a tank can be in here to soak this damage. So while one of the big selling points of Guild Wars 2 is the flexibility in classes, if they just added something a bit more formal in that distinction, made some more dungeons, made some more raids, I think the endgame staying power of Guild Wars 2 would increase dramatically. But it's here now that I think I've explained enough about Guild Wars 2 that I can start comparing it to Final Fantasy XIV to see if there is anything glaring that separates them in terms of quality, so we can start to look to answer the video's question, should we have given Guild Wars 2 more attention? I'll start where I have a couple of times already with combat, as frankly this is the biggest and most glaring difference between the two games. This actually is a multifaceted difference, as there really aren't any levels where they line up. On just a gameplay experience alone, Guild Wars 2 is a fast-paced, flailing scrum, while Final Fantasy XIV is an elaborate and methodical dance. This comes down purely to the difference in system. As in Guild Wars, you're incentivized to keep on the move, to dodge damage, and then get into melee combat to do tons of swinging AoE damage, then to get out when there's too much damage going on at the bad guy's feet, to then switch to your other weapon and start taking shots. Well, in Final Fantasy XIV, it's almost the opposite. You're encouraged to stay in one spot unless a marker tells you to, focusing more on your rotation and timing cooldowns more than just clicking whatever attacks you've got and hoping for the best. This difference goes a lot deeper than just gameplay. On a customization and just general approach level, in Final Fantasy XIV, you are railroaded by your class, but not your character. So every class is pretty much linear, getting your abilities at specific levels, and a handful of basic passives like plus 10% more damage, just to differentiate the tanking, DPS, and healing classes. All of these classes you can switch between at will, so you can be versatile before combat, but once you're in it, you're doing the one role your class defines for you, with a little bit of extra damage output if you're a healer to spice things up. Guild Wars 2, however, doesn't let you switch classes on the fly. You need alts to do that, but instead, each class contains tons of choices through the build and skill system. You can pick what sets of weapons you want, how you want to build them. Do you want to be a pure damage output, or do you want to have a mix in a little bit of support and defensive abilities in there? You have so much more in the way of customization for your class in comparison to Final Fantasy XIV or any other RPG for that matter. This then extends to how each game uses combat. In Guild Wars 2, combat is for the most part the big thing you're always doing. Fighting tons and tons of enemy in brutal melees, swinging weapons and spells around in glorious combat. While there are sections, especially in Hearts, where you can do everything passively, for the most part, the fun part is the combat. Final Fantasy XIV, on the other hand, is so much more focused on the story and conversation than just being combat. It almost feels more like the combat is a means to an end, which, while fun, isn't the big draw into the game. It's more of a highly competent system that's pretty easy to get into, but hard to master the rotations, especially for multiple classes, which is then further complicated if you go down the endgame raiding side of Final Fantasy, where rotations can slightly change as you need to use certain cooldowns to counter certain mechanics. So on every level, these two games approach combat completely differently. I don't, however, think this is a deciding factor, as really this is just two separate cups of tea for two different types of people. And as combat is a secondary factor in Final Fantasy XIV by my reckoning, I don't see this necessarily mattering over much. So the next thing, which I think has a little more impact, is the endgame. Final Fantasy XIV has a very well-established and structured endgame. Each expansion comes with a few endgame dungeons, an 8-man raid series, and a 24-man alliance raid series with 3 or so wings each that progressively unlock over the course of the post-expansion patches. Tokens that can be exchanged for gear are in these raids, and over time you get more and more powerful until a general reset when the next expansion goes live. There are also difficulty levels for each of the 8-man raid series and single boss trials that popped up throughout the story, so there's a ton in the endgame to do. That's not even to mention getting deeper into keeping crafting up to date, mount hunting, housing, and of course, glamour. Guild Wars 2 by comparison has a lot less of that formal endgame. Like I alluded to earlier, for the most part you're doing world bosses and world events. The world bosses currently in the game don't change, and the world events aren't really spiced up until a new patch which contains the next bit of story, a map, and tons of events therein. So you end up having tons of fun for a bit, then it can start to feel rapidly repetitive. Incentives as well can be fairly lacking, as there has never been that gearing reset common in basically every other MMO. So while getting ascended gear or even legendaries is a truly big task, once you've actually accomplished it, there will never be anything on that front to aim for further. This means that the PvP, which is always a big selling point, has to do a fair amount of carrying the endgame. This too can be fun, but World v World on off times can be a bit slow, as you don't have enough people for major operations, and if you get one or two bad games in the structured PvP, it can just kill the vibe for you. So unless you can find a good guild to do some raids with, which only a handful are added each expansion, the endgame for Guild Wars 2 just doesn't have as much staying power. Ultimately though, I think the endgame difference impacts the long-term health for both games, and not necessarily the initial influx of players that Final Fantasy XIV received. Hell, to get to that endgame in Final Fantasy, you have to go through more than 100 hours of story, so it's not like any WoW refugee had that in mind going in. So maybe that's where the difference is, in the story. Unlike the last two items of comparison, Final Fantasy XIV and Guild Wars 2 are relatively similar on a story front, where both have a continuous narrative that evolves patch after patch. The differences are twofold. Final Fantasy XIV's story is non-negotiable and must be done in order to progress through the story, unless of course you specifically boost past it. But even then, you can only skip so much, and you'll always have to do some of the main scenario quest. In Guild Wars' case, you can do it willy-nilly. In fact, I'd recommend, if you're a new player, once you hit level 80, you go do the first mission in Heart of Thorns and Path of Fire expansions to get your gliding and first mount respectively, before returning to where you were in the story. Both of those just revolutionize how you play the game. So you're really incentivized to do things a little out of order. This does let you watch a video on the story so far, then jump right in the next expansion, no worries if you care about the narrative, but I would recommend just going through the story itself because it's really worth going through. The second, which is smaller than this, is that Final Fantasy XIV has a very set narrative. You go through the story they want to tell you and you'll love it. Guild Wars 2 normally presents you with a few options for you to follow, like what order you want to join early in the story, or how you want to approach certain situations, like do you want to start blowing stuff up or go stealthy. Guild Wars 2 is your personal story, while Final Fantasy is the Warrior of Lights. This is the first thing that I think really impacted why people went to FF over Guild Wars. When you think about any time people tell you about Final Fantasy, a big emphasis on the fun they've had is with that story. They know the characters, they have favourite moments, expansions. That's why all the official advertisements single out Heavensward as a huge selling point, which is more for the story in the expansion than everything else, which is equally as cool. This big expansive narrative is what people tell you first about Final Fantasy XIV, and while the story in Guild Wars I would say is underrated, as it really is a ton of fun itself, when you hear about Guild Wars 2, you just don't really hear about that story element to it. But it really can't just come down to the story between the two, can it? Well, there are two more comparisons I want to make before we make the final call on answering the question of the video. First is the business aspect behind the games, and then lastly, the communities. When it comes to the business side of things, the first thing in people's mind is price. As we covered earlier, to get everything currently in Guild Wars 2, you need a minimum of $90, and if you then wanted to pre-order the next expansion, End of Dragons, on top of that, which is another $30, it comes to a total of $120 USD for a new player, which can be fairly well spread out. There is also a ton of microtransactions in the cash shop aside, but as covered, these are primarily for conveniences and skins, with nothing necessary to play the game itself. Final Fantasy XIV, by comparison, currently costs $60 for all of the expansions in the standard edition, on top of the average $14 per month subscription with 30 days free when you purchase the game. Then on top of that, there is an optional cash shop, which has basically anything you'd want, including specific class boosts, mounts, pets, and even emotes. So if you were to start playing on January 1st, buying the standard edition and nothing else by the end of the year, you'd have spent roughly $214. That subscription then keeps costing about $168 a year, assuming that the price remains steady, with an additional cost of $40 every 2 or so years for new expansion launches. On a purely financial level, Guild Wars 2 wins out by a dramatic margin, although it does put its cash shop a bit more in your face than Final Fantasy XIV does, because, well, that's its consistent source of revenue to keep up production. This business comparison does go a little bit deeper, as naturally there are companies behind these games and a full team developing it. Final Fantasy XIV team may need even less introduction than the game itself, being headed by the beloved Naoki Yoshida, who exercises unprecedented powers over how Final Fantasy is run at a business level. There can be no doubt that the decision to stop sales and give out free game time at the height of the server congestion at the launch of Endwalker was Yoshi P's and not Square Enix's. As at this stage, when you look at Square Enix as a company, the Final Fantasy team is almost separate, just sitting there making the company tons of money, so they're just kind of left alone to do that. Guild Wars 2 by comparison doesn't really have that big head or really a team behind them that is super well known. They do have a YouTube channel and do a solid job of showing off new features and general news, but there isn't the same level of communication that we'd see from the Final Fantasy team and their letters from the developer series. ArenaNet, the company behind Guild Wars 2, is also dramatically smaller than that of Square Enix and is more or less focused entirely on Guild Wars, and then just keeping their heads down. There was a bit of drama back in July 2018 when 2 game devs were fired over arguing with a community member, but aside from that, they are kind of just chilling with Guild Wars in the corner. It's this difference which I think also reflects in the communities themselves. Guild Wars 2 is like an isolated monastery where self-sufficient monks live in peace, happy with their little and tight community. Whereas Final Fantasy XIV are evangelists on the city corner preaching about how their game is great and you should come check it out. Of course, if you're just some random looking for a new game, you're going to go check out Final Fantasy XIV because ultimately there's just more out there about it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what I think is the deciding factor was. The community for Final Fantasy XIV is just out there a lot more talking about the game, bringing it up in discussion, talking about its finer points, and this is now accelerated tenfold with the addition of tons of not only WoW refugees, but also ex-WoW content creators who are at a minimum diversifying into talking about Final Fantasy. Guild Wars 2 just doesn't have that. The community is self-sufficient and it's just content with playing a really solid game. There isn't as much open hype about it or anything like that. It's just people vibing with their favourite game. So then the question of the video, does Guild Wars 2 deserve more attention? Yes, it's a great game, a unique MMO, and overall I'm a huge fan. It may not have the staying power, but it doesn't need to. I can return when there's new content and know I haven't wasted my time or money. In fact, I'd go so far as to say this game complements Final Fantasy XIV really well to you, the player. When the content for Final Fantasy XIV gets a bit dry in between patches, then I'd recommend giving Guild Wars 2 a go, as just by the content release schedule of both games, if you're up to date on both, you can just switch between the two. Your game time is always fresh, and you never need to get to that dry stage on either. This advice goes both ways as well. If you're a Guild Wars 2 player who hasn't tried Final Fantasy yet, then just do it, mate. Gun to my head, if I had to only play one of these games the rest of my life, I'd choose FF. It is an excellent game and well deserving of all the hype and the players it's been getting. And so to conclude, I honestly think Guild Wars 2 deserved a lot more attention than it got, but not at the cost of Final Fantasy XIV. Quite the opposite, because it complements each other so well. If you just got a sense of deja vu, then thank you for making it through the entire video. As I mentioned at the start, the video essays are going to begin again every fortnight, and next time I'll be covering if I think NFTs can have any place in gaming at all. So if you're interested, like, subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you next term. Until then, have an absolutely excellent week.